The sound of a blade being pulled out was heard, and the young man was not mistaken. If he doesn't confess now, it will be the last thing in his life. The hooded man is not joking. Another moment and he will plunge the sword, but he lets the word be said. The young man calms down and begins to speak, but at that very second he feels a sharp pain. Falling to his knees and bending over in pain, he decides to look the killer in the eye. The hooded man looks indifferently. He has no regrets. He did everything right. A cozy, bright room flooded with sun. In the middle of the room there is a classic-style sofa and a coffee table, an atmosphere of coziness and comfort. Seline sat on the sofa, drinking tea and calmly reading a book, not waiting for anyone. Suddenly, opening the doors, Wilfred enters the room. He smiles at Seline. Wilfred crouches in front of Seline, and looking into her eyes tells the girl how much he missed him. Suddenly, Seline notices that Wilfred's shirt is dirty. She looks at her in bewilderment, waiting for an answer. Wilfred noticed Celine's gaze and was a little embarrassed. He didn't expect that marks would be left. Seline immediately guessed everything, lowering her eyes. Wilfred was worried that this would be a reason for their separation. But Seline, overpowering herself, smiled at Wilfred. He was very glad that everything worked out. But in his head, his thoughts were completely different. Seline, seeing her sister, joyfully ran to her, but Adele pretended not to see her and quickly walked away. A little later, in the garden of the house, Seline also wanted to talk to Adele, but the maids did not allow her to do this. At the house, Seline again tried to talk to Adele, but the maids had orders not to allow Seline to see Adele. Seline sat in her room at the table and was indignant about how she could establish contact with Adele. When she thought it over, she decided to first go on a diet and start running. In front of us is a beautiful and well-kept park of the mansion. Seline was running along the path in the park. It was very difficult for her. She was tired and suddenly tripped. Raising her head, she saw her mother and sister in front of her, who were looking at her with bewilderment and fear. Seline pretended that everything was fine and ran on. Her father watched her jogging from the window. Every day, Celine's father asked the butler what she was doing, to which he gave only one answer, that she was just running. This made my father very worried and wary. The whole family gathered in the dining room. Father, mother, and Adele. Seline sat opposite her sister. Adele looks at her sister in bewilderment and does not eat anything. Seline, on the other hand, was in a very good mood, but she took a smaller portion for herself. The father began to sternly ask whether Seline was up to something, why she was behaving this way. Seline looks questioningly at her father and does not understand him. Seline realizes what is going on and decides that it is time to change the opinions of others about herself. Seline begins to ask for forgiveness, that she regrets and admits her mistakes, that envy of her sister has overshadowed her, to which Adele and everyone else were very surprised. There were tears in Celine's eyes. She sincerely asked to start studying again and to send her a teacher. The father, shocked by everything, decided to think about this question. Seline curtsied and thanked her father. A week later, still the same mansion. Seline also continues to run and is very pleased with her results. One day while jogging, Seline ran into Adele. Adele greeted her politely and wanted to say something else. The maid interrupted the conversation between the girls. She covered Adele's mouth with her hand. Seline stood in the middle of the path and looked at them in surprise. Seline decided not to be upset and continue her run. Suddenly, a black cat appeared on her way. Seline squatted down and decided to pet the cat. The cat was clearly hostile and scratched Seline. The girl pretended that nothing had happened and tried to pet the cat again. This time, she succeeded, and the cat calmly allowed himself to be picked up. Suddenly, the cat jumps out of the girl's hands and runs away. Seline decided to catch up with him and ran after him. Suddenly, someone calls out to her. It was a fair-haired, handsome young man. It was Prince Louie Percival. Seline looks at him in fascination. Seline and Louie begin to greet each other in a friendly manner. Seline remembered how much she and her sister liked him, so Adele wanted to tell her something. Seline was embarrassed that she met Louis in this form. Louis looked at Seline in a friendly way, and Seline thought how good he was. Adele saw the conversation between Louis and Seline and was very worried about it. But Seline reassured Adele and explained that the meeting was just an accident. And then the thought flashed through Celine's head that if we make it so that she doesn't care about Louis. Seline immediately said goodbye and ran on. Adele, Louis, and the servants stood with their mouths open, clearly not expecting such a turn of events. Adele wanted her sister back. but Seline only apologized and moved on. Louis remained standing there, not understanding anything. Celine's room. Seline sat at the table and studied hard under the stern gaze of the teacher. The teacher checks Celine's assignments. After successfully completing the tasks, the father hires a teacher for Seline on a permanent basis. Seline tries harder to study books to learn more about this world and understand how to use magic. After reading the book, Seline decides to take up physical exercise. Hall in the Eldred mansion. The maids discuss the changes in Seline. One of them believes that a person can change, but the others cannot. Seline is very pleased that her changes are bearing fruit. Seline lies on the grass and is very happy that the weight is starting to come off. The girl decides to do a couple more exercises and stretches her arms forward. Suddenly, she notices a strange shadow near a tree. A young man was lying on the grass under a tree. He clearly needed help. Seline made sure to put her ear to his chest to make sure he was alive. Raising the boy to his feet, she saw strange patterns on his chest. Seline decides to bring him into the house. Having laid him on the bed, Seline called the doctor. Seline was very worried about this boy and wanted everything to work out. The doctor examined the young man and thought about it, saying that this was a curse. Seline walked up to the bed and looked at the boy with concern, as if he were familiar to her. While the young man lay sleeping, Seline sat next to him and looked for something to lift the curse. The doctor also came and examined him, but the doctor gave a disappointing prognosis. Seline understood that everyone in the house was afraid of curses. Mr. Eldred was furious that Seline brought the boy into the house. Seline defended the young man in every possible way, and that she could not leave him there. The father could not understand why she was fighting so fiercely for the stranger. Seline could not answer him. She remembered herself when she was sick with an incurable disease. How lonely she was, that everyone turned away from her. She convinces her father that she can handle everything herself, and the boy won't bother anyone. Walking to her room, Seline heard the maids talking about a terrible curse, but she was determined to help the young man and began to think about how to get the holy water that she had read about in the book. The idea came to Celine's head to sell all her outfits and buy holy water with the money. The maids were shocked by this decision, but Seline was not inclined and asked them to do it as quickly as possible. The servants were afraid of the curse, but they obeyed the order. Seline knew that she was doing everything right. When Seline came to the boy's room, she discovered he had a fever. She took him by the hand and asked only one thing, that he would endure until the holy water was brought. Since no one was helping Seline and she had to look after the young man herself, she took a bowl of water and went to get some ice. In the corridor, she met Adele, accompanied by maids who, in a panic, rushed to Seline with questions. Seline, pretending that everything was fine, went to the kitchen. Adele could not believe that Seline was caring for the found boy alone. Seline says goodbye to her sister and leaves. The kitchen, the smell of food, and many different things. The cook looks at Seline in bewilderment and shows where to find something. Seline takes the ice herself because she promised her father to do everything herself. Seline thanks the cook and leaves. The cook and maid look at her in surprise. Walking down the corridor with a bowl of ice water, Seline realizes that it is so simple, and it becomes hard for her. Suddenly, someone snatches the bowl from her hands. She looks up and sees the maid's smiling face. The maid decides to help Seline carry the bowl to the room where the boy lies. Seline thanks the maid, but she tries to continue helping her. Then Seline tells her about the curse. But the maid is not afraid and continues to look after the boy. Seline was very happy and thanked the maid again. The maid said that Seline could now count on her and call her when needed. Seline had a strange feeling. Whether she was talking to a friend, she liked this feeling. Living room of Eldred's house. Seline twirls a small bottle of holy water in her hands. Seline sits in her room and sighs sadly that she managed to buy so little holy water with the money raised. She pours all the water into the boy's mouth. Seline sits down next to her and waits to see what will happen. Sitting next to the boy's bed, Seline falls asleep. A sound wakes her up. Seline rubs her eyes and sees that the boy is sitting in front of her on the bed and looking in fear. Seline quickly jumps up with joy, touches his elbow and says her name. The boy pushes her away and Seline gets scared herself. The boy grabbed his elbow and his gaze became unkind. Seline realizes that he is scared and tries to get acquainted. She began to tell how she found him. The young man did not make a sound, but simply listened. Seline kept chatting and telling stories, and the young man sat in bed listening. Seline decided to leave the young man alone and left the room. Leaving the room, Seline was glad that he had woken up. The next morning, Seline entered the room to her new guest in a good mood. The boy was sitting on the bed and was very sad. Seline hurried to open the window so that the fresh air would invigorate the incredulous guest. Seline offers the boy breakfast, but the boy remained sitting on the bed and did not pay attention to the food. Then Seline decides to leave the food on the table. At lunch, Seline brought flowers to the boy's room. In the evening, she brought him a change of clothes and underwear. The next day, Seline came to the boy again in the hope that he would say something to her. Seline tried in every possible way to attract his attention, but he was silent. And even when the boy once again refused to eat, she did not lose hope that he would speak again. Seline was very upset that the boy did not eat anything. In the kitchen, Seline startled the cook when she brought back the food that the boy didn't eat by bowing and apologizing for his needless suffering in preparing the food. Coming out of the kitchen, Seline still asked to cook for him. Evening, Celine's room. Seline lay on her bed and sobbed into her pillow. She was already beginning to regret that she had brought this young man into the house. Then she turned over on her back and began to drive away bad thoughts from herself. The next day, Seline entered the boy's room with a pleased look and brought food, which she praised. But the boy did not seem to see or hear her. Then Seline decided to try to bring the spoon to his mouth. But then the spoon flew down. The boy forcefully knocked the spoon out of Celine's hands and it fell to the floor. Seline was very scared at first. But then, having pulled herself together and calmed down, she said that she didn't want to scare him at all. Seline knelt down to clean up the smeared food from the floor, and unexpectedly, she began to cry. She did not want the boy to see her tears, and under a simple pretext, she ran out of the room. The guy remained sitting and silent. Night has come. Finally, changes began to occur in the young man. He got out of bed, holding his hand. In agony, he headed towards the exit. Going out into the corridor, he heard the maids talking. The young man listened and was surprised at what Seline would do for him. Having listened to the end of the conversation and realizing that Seline was treated with hostility here, he went back to the room. Morning has come. Seline was bringing breakfast to the young man again and was worried about how to behave now after yesterday. Entering the room, she hastened to immediately apologize for yesterday's behavior. The boy sat on the ottoman and silently listened to her. Seline notices that he has changed into new clothes. Seline places the food tray in front of him and offers him something to eat. The guy still sat with a saddened look and was silent. Seline decides to leave him alone. Suddenly, she froze in surprise and opened her eyes wide. The guy started eating. The guy ate in silence, and Seline was simply delighted. A little later in the kitchen, Seline ran joyfully into the kitchen and told him everything the boy had eaten. In the kitchen, this news also made everyone happy. The cook and the maid Jenna began to discuss further how and what to cook. Listening to them, Seline was so glad that her labors were not in vain. The Eldred family at the dinner table. Seline was happily eating her lunch when she was interrupted by her father's question. Her father asked her about the boy she brought. Seline told me with great pleasure that everything was getting better. Celine's father was clearly surprised. Then the father said that the reception of the first prince would soon take place, and he was concerned that Seline did not take pocket money at all. Surprised by this news, she asked her sister what she would wear. Seline praises that Adele will be beautiful in any outfit, and then she utters a phrase that she did not intend to utter. Adele looks at her, dumbfounded. Suddenly, Adele jumps up and demands that Seline choose a dress for her. Seline remembered all the unsuccessful attempts to get along with Adele. Seline agrees to help Adele. The parents are very happy that the girls are together. A little later, in the boys' room, Seline sat in her thoughts. Then she asked if there was anything she needed to buy him. She was going through different things to buy in her head, and suddenly remembered that she didn't even know his name. Seline decides to ask his name. The boy hesitates, and Seline waits with bated breath. The boy quietly calls his name. Seline is simply delighted. Seline does not forget to thank him. The girl is so happy and hopes for further rapprochement with Will. Palace of the First Prince. Louis sits at the table and drinks coffee alone. There are 3 envelopes on the table in front of him. His solitude is interrupted by the butler. Louis tells the butler what he cares about. The butler consoles him a little. Louis realizes that he is right. Louis opens the envelope with Celine's reply. Meanwhile, Seline and Adele go shopping at the store. Seline is delighted that they chose a great outfit for Adele. Adele is a little embarrassed. In the store, Seline cannot stop at just one thing. It seems to her that everyone is very good. She is ready to buy everything. In the joyful commotion, Adele remarks that it wouldn't hurt to look at Celine's dress, too. Adele asks hesitantly and warily if she can choose him. To her surprise, Celine agrees. Celine's new dress was gorgeous. The girls were delighted. Then they sat in a cafe and drank a cup of coffee. The girls bought matching hairpins for themselves. Already at home, Celine was glad that going to the store brought her pleasure. She thanks her sister for her time. Adele makes a surprised face, but Celine continues to talk happily. Suddenly, Celine notices that something is happening to Adele. Adele clenches her hands into fists. Celine does not understand what happened and rushes to Adele, who is crying. Celine tries to calm her sister down. Adele's tears began to flow even more. Celine hugs her sister. Celine and Adele sat in the room, holding hands. Adele dozed off, and Celine was thinking. And then she is overcome by the thought that she must do everything possible to make Adele happy. After crying, Celine's eyes became swollen and red. With such eyes, she came to Will's room. Celine brought him gifts. Celine pulled a bunch of new clothes out of the box. Then she took out various sweets. Then she took out different toys, because she didn't know which ones would be suitable for the boy. Will sat simply dumbfounded by everything. Adele admitted that she really wanted to please him, that she got a little carried away. Will sat silently on the ottoman. Then he squeezed the blanket with his hand. Will thanks Celine, who did not expect this from him. Celine is so happy and asks Will not to be shy and to use everything she brought. Celine was in seventh heaven. It was truly a happy day for her. A month has passed. Jenna was helping Celine with her hair in her room. When Jenna finished, Celine thanked her. Jenna was now Celine's personal maid. During the times when Celine behaved disgustingly, the maids ran away from her, and the place was free. Therefore, when her father started talking about a maid, Celine immediately chose Jenna. Jenna noticed that Celine had gotten slimmer. Celine agrees with her, but says that there is still a long way to go. Celine decided to go to Will. On the way to Will, she meets her stepmother and Adele. Celine greets them joyfully. Celine is very pleased that she has a good relationship with her stepmother and Adele. Adele invites Celine to prepare some sweets after dinner. On a happy note, the girls say goodbye. In a good mood, Celine enters Will's room. Will was sitting at the table, dressed in new clothes, reading a book. Will greeted Celine. Celine patted him on the head and praised him for his efforts in his studies. Time passed, and Will was practically healthy and could do everyday activities. Will has yet to tell Celine about his past. Celine was Will's teacher. Will was grateful to Celine. Celine was simply happy. For Celine, Will became like a younger brother. Thanks to Celine's efforts, the maids began to shun and fear her less. Celine invites Will to go for a walk. While Will was thinking what to answer, Celine had already grabbed his hand and led him outside. Walking through the park, Celine kept asking about Will's well-being. In one place in the park, they found mushrooms. Will warns Celine that mushrooms give her a stomachache. Will admits that he ate them when he was hungry. Celine confesses to Will that she believes in love and is waiting for a prince. Celine reports that Will will be alone all day tomorrow. She tells him about the royal reception. Will asks about Adele. Celine admits that Adele comes first for her. Not noticing that Will was upset, Celine says goodbye to him. Royal reception. Celine and Adele came to the royal reception in their new outfits. There were many different guests at the reception. Celine liked it here. She looked at everything around her. It was her first time at a reception. At the reception, Celine and Adele met two of Adele's girls. The girls were extremely surprised and unhappy when they saw Celine next to Adele. Celine guessed why they were greeting her like that, but she greeted the girls nicely. Even young people, seeing Celine, began to whisper to each other. Everyone paid attention to Celine, but also noticed changes in her. Celine heard all this whispering and felt glances in her direction. She felt uneasy. Celine decides to leave Adele and go for a walk alone. But at the last moment, Adele grabs her and stops her. The guests were clearly shocked by what they saw. While Adele was telling Celine that she was glad they came together, a human figure approached them. It was Prince Louie, and he greeted both girls. The girls curtsied to him. Celine really liked Louie. Celine thought it would be nice to leave Adele and Louie alone. As soon as Celine came up with a reason to leave, she heard that Adele was already leaving. Celine clearly did not expect such a turn. She really regretted not telling Adele what she thought about the prince. Celine makes an attempt to detain Adele. On the contrary, Louis seems very happy. The prince took Celine by the hand and they walked past the guests. Celine still couldn't believe it. Celine was worried that she did not know what to talk about with the prince. Louis spoke first. Seline admitted that she herself wanted to change. Seline told Louie everything as it was. Louie listened to her carefully. Then Seline remembered that she had caused problems for Louie too. Louis began to take an interest in Celine's training. Seline was pleased that her father noticed her efforts. Seline decides to tell Louis about her weight loss. Louis compliments her. Seline jokingly thanks him and does not take the prince's words seriously. Seline and Louis were walking, and the prince was interested in her philology classes. A little later, they said goodbye. Seline looked after the departing prince and thought about the future. Then Louis stopped and asked if he could meet Seline again. Seline was glad. She thought first of all about Adele. Seline is pleased with herself. Seline goes back and finds a cheerful Adele. Adele, Seline, and Will are sitting in a room drinking tea and talking together. Seline reports that she did not make friends with anyone during the reception. Adele consoles her with words. Seline hints that Will needs friends too. He confesses to Seline that she is his only friend. This confession touched Seline. She hugs Will and is glad that he is attached to her. Adele wonders if Willou likes Seline. Seline, still holding Will in her arms, admits that he is like a little brother to her. Then Adele remembered about the reception and that Seline had talked with the prince for a long time. Seline tells Adele that she is not interested in the prince. Adele is surprised by her confession because Seline used to adore Louis. Listening to the girls' conversation, Will wonders who Louis is. Upon learning that Seline liked the prince, Will clenches his fists tightly. House of Duke Eldred. Seline notices the commotion in the house about the prince's arrival. While studying with Will, Seline is surprised by his memory. Seline was lost in her thoughts when suddenly Will drew her attention to the window. Prince Louis Percival arrived at the Duke's house. Will compares himself and the prince. Seline is surprised by Will's thoughts. A maid entered the room and asked Miss Seline to come down for tea. Seline looks at the maid in confusion. She leaves Will and goes away. Will grabs her hand. He doesn't want Seline to leave. Seline reassures Will that she won't be long. Will, holding her hand tightly, insists on his own. This is the first time Seline sees him in this state. Seline breaks out of his hands. She needs to go. They are waiting for her. Will is left alone in the room. Meanwhile, in the living room of Duke Eldred's house, Louis notices that Seline is somewhat quiet. Seline is trying to come up with something on the fly. Adele joins the conversation. Seline notices that they only talk to her. Seline sat and sweetly kept up the conversation, but her thoughts were on something completely different. Seline becomes more and more irritated by the attention paid to her by Adele and Louis. She reports business and wants to leave. Louis clearly did not expect such a short communication with Seline. Adele remembers Will. Louis was even more amazed than Celine's quick departure. Adele told the prince how Will appeared in their house. Louis wonders why she decided to look after him herself. Seline answered Louis, but kept silent about the main thing. Louis decides to see this Will. Seline doesn't really like this idea. In the following days, Louis came again. This really bothered Seline. After seeing Louis off, Seline once again asks the butler about the prince's frequent visits. The butler tells Seline that the prince is choosing a bride. Seline consoles herself with the thought that it is Adele, not her. In the library, Seline and Will are reading a book. Will is disturbed by the frequent meetings between Seline and the prince. Seline just laughed. Seline is worried that Will doesn't want to communicate with anyone, only her. She invites him to go to the park with her, Eldred House Park. Seline pays attention to the blooming flowers. The girl tries to find out what Will likes. Will's answer clearly shocked her. Will takes her hand in his and wants to know how much she likes him. Seline looks at him and doesn't know what to answer. Will confesses his feelings to her. Seline, pretending that she did not understand Will, says that he is also important to her. They silently continue to walk through the park, when suddenly Will stopped abruptly. Seline sees that Prince Louis has arrived again. Seline was very surprised by the appearance of the prince. Her father said that it was he who invited Louis. Louis turns his attention to the young man standing next to Seline. For some time, the young people studied each other closely. Louis decided to be the first to break the silence. Will did not answer, but only looked at the prince angrily. As Seline predicted, it would be better if this meeting did not happen. Seline decides to intervene in the conversation, when suddenly Will turns her around and takes her away. Seline apologizes and leaves with Will's room. Seline tries to understand what is happening to Will. Seline hugs Will tightly. Evening came. Seline suggested that something from the past had this effect on Will. Seline encourages him. Will understands everything in his own way and grabs Seline with his hand. Seline thinks that Will is simply afraid of loneliness. She again remembers herself in the hospital room. She hugs Will and promises him to be with him. While combing her hair, Jenna compliments Seline. Seline is glad that the maids began to communicate with her more. Seline mentions Adele and Louie in conversation, but Jenna tells her interesting news. Seline thinks in surprise. Then the image of Wilfred appears in front of her. Seline asks about her plans for the day. Seline studies hard, and he also diligently practices magic. After classes in the park, Adele, Seline, and Will are having a nice time. Strange thoughts appear in Celine's head. Seline is more and more lost in her thoughts. Returning back to the guys, Seline turns to Will. Seline notices that Will didn't answer right away. The girl forces Will to immediately say if something is wrong. Adele says it's time to go home. Seline wonders what to do at home. When they returned, the girls said goodbye to Willifred. Seline invites her sister to play. Night, Wilfred's room. Will is awake. Something is bothering him. The curse pattern appears on his body again. Will falls to the floor. Seline looked at herself in the mirror. She was embarrassed when the butler noticed her doing this. Between lessons, Seline continued to run and followed a diet. But next to her, if she stood next to her sister, then Adele was still slimmer. Seline is thinking about how to further speed up her weight loss process. Seline is very pleased with the butler's tips. She thanks him and goes about her business. Eldred's living room. The guests were glad to see Seline. Seline thanks everyone for agreeing to come to her tea party. Mom suggested that Seline have a tea party so that Seline would have a chance to make friends. Seline tried to be kind and sociable in order to impress. Adele praised Seline. Seline was grateful to her sister for this. Seline began to realize that hosting guests would be a failure for her. A certain person approached Seline. A beautiful green-eyed girl was looking at Seline. It was Wilhelmina. Wilhelmina reminded Seline of her past pranks on Adele. Adele was simply furious with such talk. Seline did not hide anything and told what her reconciliation with Adele was like. To the surprise of the sisters, Wilhelmina reacted with understanding. Here Velgemina turned her attention to the sweets. Other girls also began to try and everyone liked it. Seline couldn't believe her ears. Soon, all the girls were communicating in a large and friendly group. Seeing Wilhelmina off, Seline asked her about the conversation in the living room. Wilhelmina pretended that she did not understand what Seline was talking about. And then, blushing and embarrassed, Seline asked Wilhelmina about friendship. Wilhelmina agrees. From what she heard, Seline even opened her mouth. The girls agreed to meet again. At a family dinner, Seline announced that she had made a friend. Her parents were happy for her. Seline thanks Adele. Seline's father also praises her for her academic success. Seline could not hold back her tears of joy because this was the first praise from her father. In Duke Eldred Park, Will helps the gardener. Seline is very pleased with Will's efforts. Wilfred gives Seline a flower. Seline is very touched by this gesture. Wilfred is very happy. Seline was very happy in this life. Will is incredulous about Seline's joy in the flower, but Seline is really happy. Then Will decides to continue giving gifts to Seline. But for Seline, a healthy Will is already a gift. Then she notices that Will has become sad. Will chose not to say anything to Seline. Seline reminds Will to tell her everything right away if something happens. But Seline has doubts, and she decides to take Will to the doctor. Seline spends her time practicing magic. The teacher warns Seline that it won't be easy. But Seline is full of strength and optimism. They started their classes. At the first lesson, Seline did not succeed. Seline noticed a wilted flower in the flower bed. She decides to help him, taking advantage of her new knowledge. Concentrating, she notices that something unusual is happening. The flower suddenly became as if it had just bloomed. The teacher interrupted her and asked her to finish class. Seline obeyed him. In the house of Duke Eldred, Seline walked in thought. For some reason, her father invited her. The thoughts in her head were very different. She meets Adele in the corridor. Adele tells Seline that she knows why her father invited her. Seline timidly enters her father's office. In the office, there was not only the father, but also the butler and the teacher. Seline feels that something is wrong here and the teacher is here for a reason. Her father talks to her about magic. Seline is so surprised by her father's statements that she cannot say anything. Seline insists it's all a mistake and she can't be a goddess. Then Seline's father asks the teacher to give him something. It was a black stone that lay neatly on a pillow. The teacher brings the stone to Seline and asks her to touch it. As soon as Seline touches the stone, something magical happens. After removing their hand, everyone noticed that the stone had changed color. Seline's father couldn't believe his eyes. The teacher tells everyone what exactly happened. Seline doesn't believe what's happening. The teacher claims that it is Seline who possesses the magic of the goddess. The father was clearly pleased with this discovery, but Seline didn't hear them. She looked at her hands, and a whole bunch of thoughts flew in a swarm in her head. Seline can't believe what she's hearing. Seline is simply in a panic because she didn't want this at all. She urgently needs to come up with something. After hearing from her father, Seline is not herself. Even during classes with Will, she cannot help but think about it. Seline tested her magic all the time. Now she is worried about Adele's future, which most likely is not as happy as she wanted. Seline was even more frightened by her engagement to the prince. Will snaps her out of her thoughts. Seline pretends that everything is fine. Suddenly, Will felt pain in his chest. He, like Seline, does not tell the truth. Seline decides to bring him lunch. While having tea, Louie becomes interested in Seline's magic. Adele is simply delighted that Seline's magic has awakened, but Seline is modest. Seline wonders where this magic even comes from. Seline still does not lose hope that the magic will awaken in Adele. While Seline struggles with her thoughts, Adele and Louis find explanations for her strange behavior. Then Adele remembers about some sweets for Seline. Adele leaves, leaving Louis and Seline alone. Disturbing Seline's thoughts, the prince invites her for a walk. To Louis's surprise, Seline asks to consult with Adele. Louis makes it clear that the walk is just for the two of them. Later in the living room, Adele calls the walk a date, but it never occurred to Seline that this was an invitation to a date. Adele notices that Seline is not very enthusiastic about this idea, and then Seline decides to ask Adele her opinion about the prince. But Adele doesn't quite understand what her sister is getting at. Then Seline poses the question more specifically. Having received a response from Adele, Seline was simply perplexed. Adele already suggests getting ready for a date. Seline hugs her sister, but her thoughts do not leave her alone. While visiting Wilhelmina, Seline tells her about the prince's invitation. Wilhelmina, like Adele, is also sure that this is a date. Wilhelmina notices that Seline is not particularly happy about the date. Seline shares her innermost thoughts with her. Wilhelmina convinces Seline that a love marriage is also possible. Wilhelmina gives an example of such a marriage. Seline and Wilhelmina flirt like real friends. Seline's room. Seline is getting ready for a date. Seline gives Jenna instructions about Will. Seline, secretly from Will, called a doctor for him, visiting the prince. Seline and Prince Louis talk about their day. Louis mentions Seline's magic. Smiling at Louis, she is very depressed inside. Louis offers to try something else. Louis's words reminded Seline of Will. Louis offers to take Seline home before it's too late. On the street, Seline will hear someone crying. Seline runs up to the boy. Seline notices the boy's broken knee. Unable to think of anything better, Seline decides to use her power. The boy was simply shocked by what he saw, but Seline, smiling sweetly, just put her index finger to her mouth. The prince watched this whole story. Soon, Louis brought Seline home and they agreed to meet again. Returning to the house, Seline first went to Jenna. Before Seline had time to ask, Adele ran out to her screaming. Adele, in tears, could only say the name Will. Seline immediately ran to Will's room, where he was lying on the bed like a few months ago. Seline realized that Will had been ill for a long time. She remembers holy water. But the doctor says that now this will not help. Seline simply cannot believe that there are no more ways to help Will. Jenna reminds Seline that she needs to go to the temple tomorrow. She also brings Seline some food and a book. Seline flips through the book without any interest. In the book, Seline finds something about the goddess's magic. She decides to try her magic on Will. She takes Wilfred by the hand and tries to help him. Seline did not give up and endured all the pain that came from this curse. Seline is lying in bed in her room. The first thing Seline sees when she opens her eyes is the frightened faces of the maid and sister. Then Seline jumps up sharply and asks about Will. Seline was so happy that Will felt better, but Adele was not particularly happy that Seline did this. Seline asks if her father was informed about what happened. Seline understands that Adele had to lie. Jenna says that they need to get ready for the temple. Adele reassures her sister that she will look after Will. In the temple, Seline learns that she has practically no goddess magic. Seline's father is simply furious with what he hears, but the temple representative insisted. Seline was only happy about this news, but deep down she felt guilty before her father. After the temple, Seline immediately hurried to Will. Seline began to ask about his health. Suddenly she fell silent because a different Will was looking at her, or rather, a Will with a different eye color. Seline wanted to ask Will himself about his eyes. Finally, her thoughts began to form a single picture. Seline decides to ask Will about his origins. Will apologizes for hiding his origins from Seline. Seline doesn't hold a grudge against him. Wilfred says his real name. Will is worried that something will change between him and Seline. But Seline makes him understand that everything will be as before. Suddenly, Will presses himself against Seline. Wilfred doesn't want to lose Seline. Seline promises that she will not leave him. They decide to keep Will's origins a secret from everyone. Seline asks Will not to show himself to anyone. Night. Celine's room. Seline is completely at a loss. She doesn't know what to do next. From all these thoughts, she begins to cry bitterly. Wilfred can't sleep. He wants to see Seline again. Putting on his cap, he decides to leave the room. Passing by one of the rooms, he hears a snippet of conversation that left him in shock. Adele and Jenna have a candid conversation. Then Will has a brilliant idea. The next morning, Seline immediately rushes to Will. But when she entered his room, a strange picture appeared in front of her. Will tells Seline that he intends to go to the royal castle. Seline is speechless from what she hears. Seline does not understand what happened overnight. Will intends to become a prince again. Seline worries about him. Duke Eldred enters the room. The father tells Seline that he knows everything about Will. Will sat silently next to Seline. Seline realized that her father knew about her lies and began to ask for forgiveness. But the Duke had other thoughts about Celine's act. Seline couldn't believe that her father didn't hold a grudge against her. Seline is glad that now there will be no engagement to Louie. Duke Eldred takes Wilfred under his protection. The Duke conveys to Seline a plan that must be followed. Seline worries that if Will returns to the royal castle, he will forget her. Will asks Seline for forgiveness. Seline wants to know why Will made this decision. Will started to say something, but then he just hugged Seline. Seline hugged him back, as if this was their last meeting. Both admit their liking for each other. Of course, Adele knew about everything. Seline is pleased that now Adele is not in danger. Suddenly, the Duke announces that Seline is waiting for Louie. Seline is extremely surprised by his visit. Prince Louie asks Seline a strange question. Seline doesn't understand what he's talking about. Louie knows that Seline has the power of a goddess. Louie told Seline that he saw her heal the boy. Seline did not find what to answer and only repeated the words of the Archbishop. Seline wonders why Louie is so nervous. It is important for Louie to know how Seline feels about him. And the prince says what Seline feared most. Seline was shocked by the prince's words. Louie notices his interlocutor's confusion. Seline finds something to answer. Then the prince decides to win the heart of his beloved girl. While Seline was talking to the prince, Adele and Will spent time together. Seline returns to Huila and Adele. She tries to hide her inner excitement. She told them that her father had not told her anything special. The day has come when Will goes to the kingdom. Seline gives some parting words to Will. Seline can't hold back her tears. Finally, Wilfred tells Seline about his feelings for her. Seline reciprocates. Celine's room. Seline is waiting for her father to return. Seline constantly thinks about Will and continues her studies. Seline was very pleased with the Duke's arrival. Father tells Seline how Will is doing. As soon as Seline started talking about meeting Will, her father stopped abruptly. The Duke informs Seline that there is no question of any meeting with Prince Wilfred. Seline wants to know the reason. The Duke explains all the conditions under which Seline will be able to see Will again. The father calms his daughter down and says that this is necessary. But for Seline, the Duke reports good news. Without delay, Seline immediately began writing a letter. Seline and Adele were invited to Wilhelmina's birthday party. This time, the girls greet the sisters first. Seline decides to take a little walk alone. But as soon as she goes out onto the balcony, she freezes in amazement. Seline is very surprised that the prince is here. Louis invites her to come get some air with him. Seline is mesmerized by the view. Then Louis starts talking about Will. Seline does not hide the fact that she misses him. Seline worries whether the brothers see each other. Seline admits to Louis that Wilfred is very dear to her. Seline notices some changes in the prince. The prince only asks her to return to the guests. Adele and Seline chat over a cup of tea in the garden. Jenna brings a letter from Wilfred. After reading the letter, Seline cannot contain her emotions. The girls are glad that everything is fine. Seline decides to study hard so that she can meet Will in all his glory. Duke Eldred's house 6 years later. Adele and Jenna discuss Seline and Wilfred's future meeting. Jenna tells Seline that the crew is ready and waiting only for her. Seline is looking forward to meeting Will. Seline is looking forward to the meeting. Seline goes to the royal castle. Seline was so nervous the whole way that she didn't notice she arrived. The royal castle was simply gorgeous. A maid meets her at the castle. While waiting for Will, Seline dozed off. Seline, in her sleep, cannot understand anything, but then she throws herself on Will's neck with joy. Seline notices that Will has matured. Finally, having fully examined Will, she simply cannot believe that it is him. Will notices that Seline is acting strangely, but Seline reassures him that everything is fine. Wilfred gently touches Celine's face and compliments her. Will wants to take a closer look at Celine's face. Seline is clearly perplexed by this turn. The maid violates Will and Celine's privacy. Seline takes a breath. Wilfred grabs Celine's hand and presses against her. He missed her very much. Seline feels awkward. Seline can't stand it and pushes Will away from her. Seline switches the conversation in a different direction. The girl is also concerned about the health of the second prince. Wilfred wonders what Seline has been doing all these 6 years. Will wonders if Seline has any fans. Seline is modest in front of Will and is a little disingenuous. But Will wonders if Seline likes any of the young people. Seely also wondered what Will did in the royal family. Wilfred answers in general terms. Will admits to Seline that he has a goal for which he is ready to do anything. Seline is surprised how many times Wilfred has read her letters. The first thing that comes to Celine's mind is that Will was lonely in the castle, which is why he missed her so much. She assumes that Wilfred will be an eligible bachelor in the future. Will tells Seline once again that she is his lady love, but Seline doesn't hear him. It's time to say goodbye. Wilfred doesn't want to let Seline go. He reminds Seline of their oath. Seline, remembering the oath, repeats her words about her sympathy for Will. The second prince states that his feelings are completely different. Seline doesn't understand what Will is talking about. Will is in no hurry to reveal all his cards to Seline. Will kisses Seline tenderly near her ear. Seline screams in fear and abruptly gets up from the sofa. Will doesn't see anything wrong with this, because Seline did the same thing when he lived in her father's house. Wilfred hugs Seline tightly again. Seline understands that this can no longer be done. She needs to explain to him that she needs to be able to keep her distance. Will once again lets her know that she is special to him. Seline is going home. Seline reminds that in a week they will meet again. Holding Will's hands, Seline calms him down. Then Will says something incomprehensible. Will tries to pretend that nothing happened. Seline goes home. Coming out of the castle, Seline was in the most positive thoughts. Then Prince Louie interrupted her thoughts. Prince Louis is interested in Celine's visit to the castle. Seline tells him in his ear why she came. Louis didn't show that he was bothered by this and just listened to Seline. Unexpectedly for Seline, Louis moves closer and touches her face with his hand. Seline was not ready to share more frank thoughts with him. Louis accompanies Seline to the gate. Wilfred watched them silently from the castle window. Dining room in Duke Eldred's house. Seline tells everyone that Will is doing well and that he has grown a lot. Celine's father is glad to hear such words from Seline. Adele is also looking forward to meeting Will. But bad things happen in the castle. It turns out that life in the castle is not at all easy for Will. The most terrible thoughts are hovering in Will's head. Will doesn't want Seline to find out about his other side. Jenna tells Seline sincerely about her beauty. Seline is a little worried because today is an important day for Will. Both sisters are in great spirits. Parents hurry up the girls, who can't stop looking at each other. Evening at the royal castle. The castle's living room is filled with the most important guests. The Duke assumes that they were late for the ceremony. Many people gathered around Wilfred. Adele cannot say a word from surprise, looking at Will. Weil notices Seline. The girls bow their heads before him as if before a real prince. Will is not particularly happy about this meeting. Seline understands that there is no other way yet. Seline leaves without saying goodbye to Will. Seline sees the Duke talking to the Queen. After hearing part of the conversation, Seline begins to realize that the Queen is not very happy with Will. The Queen notices Seline. The Queen says that she has heard about Seline from Louie. After talking with Queen Seline, Adele and her father go further to the guests. Suddenly, a hand grabs her from behind the curtain. It's Will! He points with his finger to keep her silent. Will regrets that this is the only way they can talk. Seline pats him on the head, which Wilfred really likes. Will hugs Seline tightly. He leans his head on her shoulder and says that it makes him feel better. Seline hugs him again and is ready to fight for his happiness. In such a close embrace, they were found by Prince Louis, who accidentally went out onto the balcony. Seline did not notice him, but Will, yes. Adele asked where Seline was. While thinking about Will, Seline ran into a blonde girl. The girl apologized, considering that it was her fault. Like Seline, The lady noticed her beauty. The girl turned out to be none other than the future wife of Prince Wilfred. Seline sat in her room and wrote a letter to Will. She told Jenna that Will would be able to come visit them next week. Seline, of course, was flattered by Will's attitude towards her. Then Jenna pulls her out of her thoughts with the arrival of Mr. Lewis. Seline enters the living room with curiosity because Louie said that he will not come alone. To her surprise, Louie arrived with the beauty she had encountered at the castle. The girl introduced herself as Cardelia. With mixed feelings, Seline also introduced herself to Cardelia. Cardelia complains that she has no friends here. Louise makes Seline blush a little. The girls agree to be friends. Cardelia says that she heard from Louise about Seline. Seline decides to ask Cardelia the purpose of her visit to another country. Cardelia's answer shocked Seline. Here, Louis added his word. Cardelia does not mince words about Will. Seline sat and listened to Cardelia with concern. Louise decided to interrupt Cardelia's monologue. Seline has to agree with Louis because she herself told him so. Cardelia did not let up. Seline could not even think that this would happen. Seline understood that she could not forever refuse His Highness because she was still influenced by pressure from her father. Seline sees off the guests. Louise reminds her of the engagement. Seline does not find what to answer. Leaning towards Celine's ear, he said that his choice was only her. Cardelia and Louise left, and Seline was left standing in confusion. When Wilfred came to visit Seline, everyone was surprised by his changes. Wilfred notices that Celine's room hasn't changed much. Will doesn't mind returning to the Duke's house again. Seline starts talking about Will and Cardelia's engagement. Will pretends that he doesn't understand what Seline is talking about, and Seline tells the details. Seline realizes something is happening to Will. Will wonders what else the first prince told Seline. Seline remembers their conversation, but she doesn't dare tell Will. Will guesses what Seline is silent about, when suddenly he looms over her, which scares Seline a little. Will admits to Seline that he doesn't need money or position in society, that this is just a way to get what he needs. Seline does not understand what Wilfred is talking about and looks at him questioningly. And Will utters those words that he has been carrying within himself for a long time. Finally, Seline understands the full meaning of his words. Will admits that he didn't want to rush. Seline is overcome with fear. He does not recognize Wilfred. Will realizes he went a little overboard and apologizes. Seline is at a loss and doesn't know how to behave now. The girl asks for forgiveness for her carelessness. Will also asks for forgiveness, but for his jealousy. Seline understands that it's Louie. Wilfred squeezes Celine's shoulder and demands to know about her feelings for Louise. Will is afraid of losing Seline. Seline hugs him and reassures him with words. Will is happy to hear such words from her. Will sees that something is bothering Seline. Seline speaks out loud her experiences. Wilfred listens to her with understanding. Seline also mentions Cardelia. Wilfred speaks harshly about this engagement. Seline understands how Will feels, but also understands that everything has already been decided. The prince expresses strange thoughts that frighten Seline. Seline tries to understand where Will is going with this, but their conversation is interrupted by a knock on the door. The prince is reminded of the planned meeting. Will takes Celine's hand and says he would do anything for her. Seline simply cannot recover from his touches and conversations. He sees her off. Royal Castle, night. Wilfred, with a serious look, enters the room where he was expected. A young, fair-haired man was waiting for him in the room, clearly already bored. The prince is not really in the mood for conversation. The prince's overnight guest leaned back on the sofa, holding a glass of wine in his hand. Will realizes that he does not have enough influence yet. He drinks a glass of wine. The Marquise is aware of Will's meeting with Seline. Will doesn't know what to do with Louis. The Marquis, with his words, only encourages Will to take action. The Marquis reports that the issue of the wedding between Louis and Seline has already been decided, but the second prince has a plan. The Marquis is clearly pleased, because their goals with Prince Wilfred coincide. Back home, Seline is unusually silent. Adele notices that Seline is somewhat quiet after her arrival. Seline decides to tell Adele everything. Maybe she will give advice. Adele beats Seline and hits the mark. Seline is simply shocked how she knows. Adele admits that you would have to be blind not to notice this. Seline is annoyed by her blindness, but finds an excuse for herself. Seline doesn't know what to do. Adele somehow doesn't hear Seline and adds even more fuel to the fire. Adele asks what Seline herself wants. Seline has always dreamed of love, but she also doesn't want to go against her family. Seline is in thought, because she doesn't want to leave Will either. Seline thinks soberly and tries to find a better way out of the current situation. Adele understands that they cannot tell either their father or Louie about the conversation between Seline and Will. Here, Seline still remembers from Cordelia, Will's possible bride. Seline was completely confused. Adele is trying to somehow help her sister in her difficult choice. Seline thanks her sister for her support, but Celine's heart would like to be with Will. A little later at the royal castle, in the room, Cordelia and the second Prince Wilfred were sitting on the sofa, and opposite them were Seline and the first Prince Louis. Cordelia kept trying to grab the attention of Wilfred, who was clearly not happy with such company. Louis, as befits a future groom, showed concern for Seline, who was embarrassed by such gestures in front of Will. Louis takes Celine's hands and notices that they are very cold. The first prince then carefully places his outer garment over Seline. Seline thanks His Highness for such concern. Cordelia is touched by the relationship between Seline and Louis. From Cordelia's words, Will sits not himself and accidentally drops a cup on the floor, which breaks. Everyone writes off the broken cup as an accident, except Seline. When Wilfred tries to pick up the pieces, he injures his hand. Cordelia gasps in horror. Seline rushes to Will's aid. Seline examines the wound, but does not dare to use the power of the goddess. She takes Will to the doctor. Instead of the doctor, Seline used her power and healed the wound. So that Louis and Cordelia don't have a question, Seline bandages Will's hand, so where the wound was. Arriving at Cordelia's invitation for tea, Seline never expected to meet Will and Louis together. Will explained to her why this happened. Seline still worried about Will's wound, because it was deep, but Wilfred calmed her down. Will admitted to Seline that it hurt him to watch Louis touch her. Seline felt embarrassed. Then Wilfred took her hand and kissed it as a sign of cleansing. Seline was clearly not ready for such a turn. She sweetly asks Will not to do that again, to which Will reacts in his own way. As soon as Seline said that she needed to be at a distance, Will was somehow replaced. Seline notices this change and tries to calm him down. Then there was a knock on the door. To Celine's surprise, Will became friendly and smiling again. Prince Wilfred thanked Seline for her help. Cordelia and Louis are already tired of waiting. Seline apologizes for keeping the first prince waiting. Cordelia did not let up and rejoiced at the upcoming engagement to Mr. Wilfred. At Cordelia's cheers, Will snorted that this was the first time he had heard of such a thing. But Cordelia insisted that the engagement had already been decided by the queen herself. Cordelia invites Seline to her engagement party. Seline is simply confused as to how to answer her. Without allowing Seline to answer, Louis intervenes in the conversation, thereby saving Seline from answering. Before Seline had time to rejoice, Cordelia asked her to be alone with her. Seline has no choice and agrees to talk with Cordelia. Will was clearly not happy with this idea. Cordelia makes it clear to Louis that there is no need to see Seline off. Finally, Louis touches Celine's face gently and says that they will meet again soon. Will wanted to say something before Seline left, but she bid him a friendly goodbye. The girls left the castle and went outside. Unexpectedly for Seline, Cordelia tells her the well-known news. Cordelia, with a sweet expression on her face, makes it clear to Seline that now only she will be next to Prince Wilfred. Seline wanted to say something, but Cordelia interrupted her by squeezing her hand. After Cordelia left, Seline felt pain in her chest. Will escorted Seline out the window. Louis unexpectedly grabs Will's bad arm. Having removed the bandage, Louis sees a healthy hand on which there is no trace of a wound. The first prince immediately guesses what's what. Wilfred pulls his hand away and leaves silently without explaining anything to his brother. On the way to his place, Will realizes that something needs to be done. Louis remembers today's meeting with Seline. He understands how cleverly she came up with everything, but he does not intend to give up on her. The father tells Seline that they are invited to the royal castle. The Duke thinks that they will talk about the engagement. Seline understands that nothing can be done. The father, seeing Celine's doubts, hints that everything can be cancelled. But Seline does not want the whole family to suffer because of her. While Seline is thinking, a maid enters the room with tea. The maid accidentally knocks over the delivery and the hot tea burns her hand. Seline rushes to her aid. The maid, squeezing her burnt hand, smiles sweetly. Seline understands that she could help her, but she cannot show her strength. Seline understands that it is time to make a decision and not torment herself. Adele enters the room. Small cafe. Adele distracts Seline with a trip to a cafe. The sisters chat nicely and Adele asks to go to another store. On the way to the store, Seline hears exclamations of admiration and turns around. She sees Will in the company of a young man. Will notices her. Wilfred hugs Seline tightly in front of everyone. Seline and Will are both very happy about this meeting, but Seline had other thoughts in her head. The Marquis was very surprised how Will changed when he met Seline. Will notices his friend. The Marquis introduces himself to Seline. In turn, Seline introduces Richard to Adele. Richard tries to be nice and polite, which Will doesn't like very much. Seline inquires about Richard's status for Will. Seline is glad that Will has a friend. Seline immediately began to praise Will, who did not like it. Seline tries to guess what Will is thinking about. Unexpectedly for everyone, Will invites everyone to take a walk together. Seline is simply bursting with joy, but she is not alone and asks her sister for her consent. And Richard already knows where to go. Seline is very happy to spend at least a little more time with Will. It was a small restaurant in the city where young people settled down. Seline tries to find out more about Richard. Richard compliments Adele. Seline notices that Adele is not very happy. Wilfred tries to spoon-feed Seline. Seline understands that this does not need to be done because there is a conversation about the engagement ahead and cannot refuse. Adele and Richard have been watching Will and Seline all this time. Will asks Adele to come with him. Girls are very surprised by this. Seline noted that it was the first time that Will had invited Adele somewhere. Richard invites Seline to take a little walk while he waits for his friends. Everyone goes in different directions. But when Seline and Richard returned back, they saw a large crowd of people. Seline suddenly felt something bad. Having pushed the crowd aside, Seline saw Will lying on the road. He was covered in blood. Seline couldn't believe what she saw. Adele leaned over Will and tried to heal him. The power of the goddess manifested itself in Adele. The girls bent over Will. Seline saw that Will opened his eyes and began to ask what happened. Seline watches Adele use her power. Suddenly, Adele becomes ill and falls. Seline worries about her sister, but Richard manages to catch Adele. Seline rushes to Will, who has come to his senses. Wilfred gets up, but he doesn't feel well. Richard decides what to do. Richard also reminds the guys that the crowd of people is still here. People, of course, understood what happened. The young people headed towards the carriage, and a crowd of people looked after them. 2 days have passed. Will was visiting Seline. Seline smiles now that everything is over, but then she admitted other thoughts. Seline rushes into Wilfred's arms with tears. Will remembered Celine's words about Adele and the power of the goddess. Seline was right. Adele came to her senses the next day. Adele herself doesn't understand how this happened. Seline admits that she too had the same experience. Here Adele asks about her father if he knows. Seline worries about Adele, but Adele is full of optimism. The next day, Will went to visit Seline and met Adele at the castle. Seline said that after the incident, her sister was called to the castle. Will makes an interesting suggestion. Celie realizes that Will may be right. She immediately imagined Adele and Louie, but they were indifferent to each other. Wilfred reassures Seline and thinks that Adele will not agree. Seline clarifies who we are talking about and whether she understands Will correctly. Seline is struck by such confidence in Will. Will is glad that now his engagement to Cordelia is in doubt. Will clearly knew something more than Seline. Seline did not understand where such confidence came from, because the Queen had already decided everything. Wilfred notices that Seline is not particularly happy. But Seline claims that she was simply surprised by such unexpected events. Remembering the conversation with Cordelia, Seline is simply torn apart with indignation. But Will takes her hand and says that she is the only one he needs. Seline calmed down a little, but she was still worried. A little later at Richard's house, Richard and Will drink tea. Wilfred admires Seline. Richard asks his friend not to rush so much, because last time he could have died. Richard insists that everything happened to Adele by accident, but Will did not count on her help at all. He knew that Seline would help him. Here, Richard casts past events in a different light. Richard was simply shocked at what Will's whole plan was based on. Will considers Seline to be no ordinary girl. Will is pleased that so far everything is going according to his plan. Wilfred plans to hide his plan from Seline. Will is ready to do anything to get Seline. Richard looks at his friend in surprise. Is this really love? Now Will has to resolve the issue with Cordelia. Will tells Richard that Miss Cordelia is not as simple as she seems. The Marquis does not want to help Will with Cordelia, but he immediately says that he likes Miss Cordelia. Night, Royal Castle. First, Prince Louis is sitting in his room, unable to sleep. Cordelia comes up in it and speaks out loud the thoughts tormenting Louis. Cordelia expresses her thoughts. For some reason, Louis is sure that this is not an accident, but a setup. Louis knows how the queen feels about Wilfred. The first prince goes over all the events in his head and tries to find a clue. Louis understands that Adele can now become his bride. The decision is up to the queen. But he only needs Seline, although he himself does not know why she is the one. Cordelia is sure that Louise will come up with something. As if by chance, she also throws out a phrase about herself. Louis is determined. Will scares Louis with his obsession, and Louis decides to separate them as quickly as possible. But Cordelia likes Prince Wilfred even in this form. Adele returns from the royal castle with news. In the living room of Duke Eldred's house, Adele tells Will and Seline that Prince Louis is not happy with marrying her. Will gets tired of hearing about Louis. Seline suddenly asks Will if he starts visiting her often. To Celine's surprise, Wilfred laughs it off. But Seline still needs to resolve the issue with Cordelia. Seline wonders what Wilfred's position would be in such a situation. The second prince expresses himself arrogantly, but Adele says that Prince Louis has already chosen his bride, and this is Seline. Wilfred didn't want Seline to know about this. Adele was a little embarrassed that she said something unnecessary. Unexpectedly, during the conversation, Seline remembers about the tournament. Seline remembers how events developed in another version, and she wants to believe that now everything will be different. The day of the tournament has arrived. Seline and Adele did not expect to see so many people here, especially girls. The other girls looked at the sisters with curiosity. Adele is already ready to help everyone with her power. Seline hears a familiar voice. Cordelia appeared before Seline in all her glory. Unexpectedly for Seline, Cordelia greeted her as an old friend. Cordelia does not miss the opportunity to talk with Adele. Cordelia is looking forward to the start of the tournament. The girls hear exclamatory words with familiar names. First Prince Louis and second Prince Wilfred arrived at the tournament. Cordelia immediately rushed to meet Prince Wilfred. Seline looked longingly at Cordelia and Will. Seline again feels this strange pain in her chest. Adele noticed that something had happened to Seline. Prince Louis approaches the girls. Prince Louis takes Seline by the hand and promises to make her queen. Seline looks at the prince with all his eyes and wants to say something. Louis, without waiting for what Seline would say, revealed his feelings to her. Seline understands that Louis is a good person, but she does not feel reciprocity towards him. Will watches Louis closely. Seline sits alone and drinks tea. Jenna approaches Seline and whispers a message from Will. Wilfred suggests that Seline take a walk before the tournament starts. Will doesn't want him and Seline to be seen, so he puts a hood over himself. Seline and Will are walking along a secluded forest path. Seline warns Will that something always happens at the tournament, but Will just laughs it off. The prince reminds Seline that he has nothing to fear, because if he is wounded, she can heal him. Seline mentally calms down, because now she can use the power of the goddess. Will sees that Seline is not telling her something and tries to find out what happened. Without allowing her to finish speaking, Will rushes at Seline and demands that she keep everything a secret. Will hugs Seline because this is all just so that they can be together. Seline does not understand what is happening to her. Wyfried now wants to be constantly close to Seline. He touches her face and then kisses her. But it's time for them to return. The tournament will begin soon. Seline feels that she is not feeling well. When Will and Seline were returning from a walk, Cordelia saw them. Cordelia was simply furious. Now she wants to punish Seline. Adele wonders if Seline is sick. Seline clutches her face in horror. She didn't think it was so noticeable. Seline told her sister what was wrong. After listening to Seline, Adele makes a small clarification and hits the target. Adele doesn't have time to finish, as someone called her and Seline. Cordelia approached the girls and invited them to tea. Seline, out of politeness, agrees to tea with Cordelia, but she is tormented by the question that Adele did not have time to finish. The girls have gathered at the table and are discussing the tournament. A girl approaches Seline and asks for some time. Seline asks for forgiveness and leaves. Cordelia looks pleased. Seline was lying on the grass. She comes to her senses. Sitting on the grass, Seline tries to understand what happened. She remembered how someone covered her mouth. Getting up, Seline decides to go back, but does not know which way to go. Behind her, she heard the crunch of branches and footsteps. Seline was delighted, thinking that these were the tournament participants. But one man pointed an arrow at her. An arrow flew nearby and slightly grazed my face. Seline realized that she had to run. Seline ran so fast that she couldn't resist and stumbled, and an arrow stuck into the ground right next to her head. She stood up and looked at the arrow, whether she was lucky or missed on purpose. But the hooded men were serious. Seline realizes in horror that they are hunting and hunting her. In panic, she loses her shoe. Seline understands that they want to kill her. She is very scared. Her magic is not enough for the battle. She decides to run away. After running out of cover and running a little, Seline falls. The offenders quickly catch up with her and want to kill her as quickly as possible. Seline sits disheveled on the grass in horror, her thoughts only about death. Seline remembers her past life when she was sick, but now everything has changed. Now she is not alone. In desperation, she mentally asks Wilfred for help. Having opened his eyes from a strange sound, Wilfred stands in front of Seline. Will sits down next to Seline, and she realizes that he is real and not in her dreams. Will is very sorry that he came to the rescue late, that Seline experienced such fear. Wilfred hugs Seline, but she just cries and can't say anything. Then the hooded people appeared again. Seline, seeing the hunters again, wants to run away again. Will reassures Seline and says that there is no need to worry. He will solve everything. Will takes the owl's sword and enters into dialogue with the hunters. One of the hunters accuses Will of interfering with them. Will's gaze changes, and he extends his hand forward, from which comes a bright glow. Seline realizes that Wilfred also has magic. Wilfred enjoys punishing offenders. The second prince kills one of the hunters with his sword. Blood from the sword splashes onto Seline's face. The hunters, who just recently laughed, were already asking for mercy. But Will is not going to let everyone go so easily. He kills another offender. Seline, who is watching everything, simply does not recognize Will. She never knew him like that. Seline watches in horror with how easily Will kills people. Will understands that Seline should not have seen this. Will sincerely worries about Seline and wipes the blood from her cheek with his finger. Then Wilfred jokingly asks Seline to wait a little longer, because he hasn't killed everyone yet. Seline asks Will not to kill anyone else. Will doesn't understand her because they just wanted to do this to her. Seline tries to explain to Will that killing is bad. Seline simply can't believe her ears. How easily Will disposes of people's lives. Wilfred really thinks otherwise. Seline was frozen in horror that this was not the first murder Will had committed. A whole bunch of thoughts and memories flashed through Seline's head. She asks Will to forgive her. Will doesn't understand why Seline is apologizing and crying. Seline silently rose from the grass and walked. After walking a little, Seline came across a bloody body. Seline rushed to the rescue and used her goddess powers. Will doesn't understand why she's doing this, why she's healing them. When Seline finished healing, she turned to Will and looked into his eyes. Seline expressed how she thought it should be. Seline clings to Wilfred. In any case, she is grateful to him for saving her. After everything settled down, Seline was tormented by only one question. Who wanted her dead? Seline was surprised when she was informed that a guest had come to see her. It was Wilfred. Seline immediately jumped out of her seat. Suddenly, what happened? Will is trying to understand whether Seline's attitude towards him has changed. Seline couldn't even think about it. She was just very busy. Will doesn't quite believe Selit as she lowered her eyes. But Seline assures him that everything between them is the same as before. Pressing Seline's hand to his cheek, Will is glad to hear such words, because without her, he will die. Seline believed Wilfred. Wilfred is not ready to give up killing completely. Will utters words by which Seline understands that he was not happy in the castle. Seline treats Wilfred with understanding. Will thanks Seline for her support. Wilfred and Seline are walking in the park. But Seline is tormented by one question and she decides to ask it. Having received no answer, Seline realizes that she is right. After a pause, Will decides to speak. Seline realizes that she herself doesn't know how to answer. After thinking, Seline found something to answer. Realizing that Seline will still be with him, Wilfred decides to tell her what really happened. Listening to Wilfred, Seline simply did not believe how this was possible. He endured all these sorrows only thanks to Seline. Seline, of course, never thought about parting with Will. But Will needs something more in their relationship than now. Wilfred proposes that they get married. Seline clearly did not expect such a proposal from Will. But Will has already found a bride. Will says that this marriage will not bring him happiness. Wilfred also shares his thoughts about Cordelia with Seline. We sat down simply shocked by what we heard. Wilfred doesn't insist that Seline trust him. It just takes time. Wilfred realizes that Cordelia has some purpose. Prince Wilfred never heard back from Seline about the engagement. Seline didn't even think about answering today. The second prince does not want to put pressure on Seline because he knew that their feelings for each other are different. He gives her time to think and leaves. Seline has mixed feelings about Will. While they walk to the carriage, Seline remembers everything that happened between them because perhaps she could lose him forever, and she makes the final decision. Seline also takes her father's consent. Will asks to kiss him. The prince needs to be convinced of Celine's seriousness. This kiss took Seline by surprise because she had never kissed anyone before. But Will is so persistent. Seline gathers her thoughts. Celine's consent to the kiss clearly shocks Wilfred a little. Seline is acting stupid. Wilfred is just confused. Will closes his eyes to make Celie less awkward. When Will closed his eyes, Seline just stood there and watched. Seline comes closer and closer to him. Now she is already in his face. But Will beats her to it and kisses her first. Seline automatically covers her mouth with her hands. But then she pretends that everything is as planned. The job is done. Will grabs her again and kisses her even harder. Wilfred laughs it off. The prince is just happy that he and Seline are serious. Seline is a little embarrassed. She still can't move away from the kiss. Seline is glad that Will is happy. The girl cannot hide her embarrassment for a long time. That same day, evening in the dungeons of the castle, Richard notices that Will is in a good mood. Wilfred at this time, with a satisfied look, tests his magic on a person. Richard wants to know the details. Will informed him of Celine's agreement to the engagement. For the Marquis, this was not news, but Richard knows Wilfred better than Seline. Will is simply afraid of losing Celine's favor, at which time the man comes to his senses. Richard, after listening to Wilfred, is not surprised by his idea. Richard gets tired of their activity and urges Will to go. Wilfred tries to find out who tried to kill Seline. The man does not give the name, but only the characteristics of the customer. Having finished with Celine's offender, Will is not sure that this will help punish the Duchess. But for revenge, Will is happy with any evidence. Since everyone knows about Will and Celine's engagement, the second prince is no longer acting with restraint. And Seline no longer sees him as a younger brother, but sees a man. When Will tries to kiss Seline again, she pushes him away. Will is clearly unhappy. Seline deceives him that order is important to her. Will is upset. The prince persuades Seline to just one more kiss, and Seline agrees. He kisses Seline tenderly. When the first kiss smoothly turned into the second, and then the third, Seline pushes Will away, but he laughs it off. Seline then becomes furious at Will's deception. But Will hugs Seline, and she no longer sulks at him. Will continues to joke. Seline blushes at her thoughts. Seline is still prohibited from leaving the house as the culprit has not yet been found. Seline pulled Will from his thoughts. The girl is worried that she has gained weight. Seline just needs to start exercising again. But Seline likes everyone. Seline remembers Prince Louie. Seline realizes that what Will likes about her is not her appearance, but herself. Wilfred shows a little jealousy. Seline is flattered by this attitude towards her from the young man. Will offers Seline a little trip outside the house. For Seline, such an offer sounds tempting. Will is positive, but Seline doesn't think it will be that easy. To Celine's surprise, her father allows her to go with Wilfred. Seline is looking forward to the day of the trip, and Adele will be going too. In the corridor, Seline meets Adele. Prince Louis arrived from the castle with Adele. Adele told Seline why Prince Louis came. Seline plucked up her courage and invited Louis to talk alone. Seline invited Louis into the living room and sat down opposite. Celie didn't know where to start. She hadn't met Louis since the tournament. Louis brought up the topic of what happened at the tournament. Louis then made himself comfortable and ready to listen to Seline. Seline started the conversation from afar. When she finished her speech, she could not look him in the eyes. Louis is still in good spirits. Seline is telling the truth. And then Louis's expression and tone changes. Seline clearly didn't expect this. She doesn't understand what Louis is talking about. Louis's words make Seline angry. Louis was clearly confident in his words. Seline could not even think about this. But Louis, not paying attention to Seline, continues to open her eyes to Wilfred. Seline realized that Louis clearly knew something about Will. Louis tries to prove to Seline that Will is not as good as he wants to seem. Seline doesn't know what to answer to refute Louis's words. Although Louis doesn't like Wilfred, he comes first for Seline. Louis approaches Seline and falls on one knee in front of her. He takes her hand and tries to change her mind. Seline gets up to open the door. As Seline approaches the door, Louis grabs her from behind and prevents her from opening the door. Seline tries to break free, but Louis holds her even tighter. Wilfred is standing on the other side of the door. Seline understands that she cannot allow Will to see her with Louise, but it is also dangerous to remain with Louise. Wilfred does not leave and waits for an answer from Seline. Seline is forced to lie. Wilfred has left. Louis lets her go. Seline is extremely unhappy with this behavior of Louis, but Louis somehow doesn't hear her. He continues to refuse her from Will. Then Seline reveals that she knows about Wilfred's murders. But for some reason, Louis started talking about her sister. Seline thought about it. Louis told Seline his truth. Seline doesn't want to believe Louis' words. Louis left, leaving Seline to her own devices. Seline doesn't know who to believe. She needs to go, because Will is waiting for her. Seline tried her best to act normal. Will and Adele still noticed that something had happened to Seline. Adele whispered to her that Wilfred did not know about Louis. Seline is simply grateful to her sister for her quick thinking. Will looks at the sisters with suspicion all this time. Will doesn't understand why Seline didn't sit next to him. Seline assures Will that she didn't know how to do anything against him. It just happened that way. Adele changes the subject. Adele worries whether she will disturb the young couple with her presence. Seline is beside herself. How dare Will tell Adele such a thing? But Will doesn't hesitate to express what he thinks. Hearing about the kiss, Seline wants to shut Will's mouth. Adele, closing her eyes, screamed that she had not heard anything. Will bites Celine's finger. Weil once again wants to make sure Seline is serious. Seline reciprocates. Seline assures herself that Louis made it all up. Royal Castle, night. Cordelia sits in the room with a bloody knife. Her face and hands are covered in blood. There's a knock on the door. Cordelia is happy to hear from Louise. The girl orders her maid to tidy everything up, and she herself went to Prince Louis. Cordelia is upset that her engagement to Will has been postponed due to events that she caused. After looking at the moon, Cordelia does not lose hope for an engagement. Travel day. The young people are riding in a carriage. Seline is simply delighted that she is finally allowed to be outside the house. Seline began to guess why Will invited Adele and why they went to the Marquis of Stirling at the estate. Richard tries to find out from Adele how she feels about his company. Adele answers politely, but hints that she would like to know such things in advance. Seline thinks now is the right time to thank Richard for his help. Richard responds like a gentleman should. They arrive at their destination. Seline is simply delighted by the beauty around her. Richard is very hospitable. Seline thinks it wouldn't hurt to greet Richard's parents first. Richard reports that he lives alone. The sisters glance at each other. Oddly enough, Richard has a full house of servants. Richard needs to take care of some business and leaves the guests alone. Will notices that Seline is upset. Will asks the maid to leave them alone. Wilfred tells his sisters about Richard. Adele sympathizes with Richard. Wilfred simply spoke a little about Richard's life. Will warns his sisters against the royal family. Richard returns looking pleased. He wants to show the guests his house. In the evening, the girls share their impressions with each other. Seline notices the sadness in Adele's eyes. Seline herself understands that it was not easy for Richard to survive everything. The girls decide not to dwell on Richard's sad past, but to have a lot of fun tomorrow. There was a knock on the door. Will didn't think Seline was not alone. Adele quickly gets ready to leave, leaving the young people alone, which greatly frightens Seline. Will sat down on the bed next to Seline. Wilfred leans his head on the girl's shoulder and tells her what a wonderful time he is having with her. Seline reciprocates. Seline immediately got ready to sleep, but Will is not going to quit. Seline took it all as a game at first, but Wilfred is not joking. He invites Seline to sleep together. Seline began to look for reasons why it was so wrong, but Will has studied Seline very well and knows how to get his way. Seline agrees to spend the night in the same room with Will. Night fell. Seline was almost asleep. Will hugs Seline. The girl feels awkward. Seline falls asleep and Will leaves the room. In the corridor, he meets Richard, who makes fun of him. Will does not respond to his friend's jokes, but says that he intends to return to the castle through the teleporter. Richard doesn't try to stop his friend. Will enters the room and touches the teleporter with his hand. Same night, Royal Castle. Will finds himself in the Royal Castle. Having done his business in the castle, Will even managed to get some sleep. In the morning at breakfast, the Marquis asks the girls how they slept. Adele froze in horror at the Marquis's words. Seline tries to justify herself. The guys decide to go to the city. While Seline admires the beauty, Richard suggests taking care of business. He asks Adele out on a date. Adele hesitated a bit. Richard explains his decision to her. Adele thought it would be right and agreed with Richard. Seline also had similar thoughts about Adele at this time. Celie and Will went into the store. Seline decides to give Will a gift. When the guys were together again, Seline asked how Adele spent her time. Wilfred offers to go with Seline hand in hand. Everyone is in a good mood. At night, Will again arrives at the castle through the teleporter. On his way to the teleport, Louis comes across him. Louis is surprised to see Will at the castle. Will doesn't want to talk to Louis, but Louis continues the conversation, ignoring Will's displeasure. Prince Louis enthusiastically tells Will that Seline hid their meeting from him. Will wanted to move on, but Louis' words made him stop. Will remembered this day. Louis began to tell in detail how he held Seline close to him. Wilfred seemed to lose control of himself. Will tries to kill Louis with his magic, but Louis was ready for such a turn of events and easily repels Will's attack. After weighing the pros and cons, Will stops attacking Louis. Louis is clearly surprised by his decision, but Wilfred only delayed the murder of Louis. Seline woke up. Will sat in front of her, and there were tears in his eyes. Seline rushed to him. She did not understand what was happening. With tears in his eyes, Will accused her of lying. Seline didn't understand anything. Will continued talking. He was sad. Finally, Seline understood what Wilfred was talking about. Will is persistently waiting for an answer from Seline. Will doesn't let Seline say anything. Demanding an answer, Will pinned Seline to the bed and held her hands. Seline understands that she needs to tell everything, but Will was so angry that it seemed that it wasn't Will at all. Will clutches his head. He is simply obsessed with hatred for Louis. Seline doesn't know how to console Wilfred. Suddenly, Will asks Seline to kiss him. Seline was simply taken aback by such a reaction, but if she refuses, she is afraid to imagine what will happen. Seline kisses Will. Wilfred calms down in Celine's arms. Wilfred asks Seline not to let any men near her anymore. Will kisses Seline again and tells her of love.